Hi, everybody. Okay, I had a little bit of a hiatus there, not for any other reason than just life stuff's been happening, um, and just couldn't find the time to get the video in or just allocate some energy towards it. So, no big deal. Let's get right into today. I had been meaning to make some content on talking about like what are some principles that people are consistently using that they think are evidence or science-based principles for programming hypertrophy, but actually are not, or let's say they're not the most effective way, because there's still a lot of people that go around following certain individuals in the evidence-based community that don't actually give you the proper evidence, don't give you the correct science, and this still gets propagated all over the place. And they'll say, "Well, this so and so said it, and he's got a PhD, so it must be true." But PhDs wake up every day and say some stupid shit that everybody goes around saying is factual because a PhD said it. That's not factual at all. So I was going to go through a list of things that a lot of people still say that they think is science based, and sometimes, worse times, a lot of these guys will still cite studies and then not actually break down what I call the granularity or the nuance of the study to let you know whether or not it's actually a good study to kind of use. So I've kind of covered volume, and so that I don't really feel like that's one of them. Clearly, is that a lot of people still run around saying higher volumes drive more muscle mass, and if you just say it like that at face value, that is true because 3 sets will always beat out 1 set in terms of driving up hypertrophy outcomes. But the idea that you need to do excessive amounts of volumes to get more hypertrophy is absolutely just not true. And we have a multitude, we have study after study after study after study that are well done, that are replicatable, that show that's just not the case. So let's get into the one. I posted this on Instagram yesterday. So if you go and you find this post, it was basically my take is that if your goal, if your number one goal is training for hypertrophy, for muscle mass, then there's really no reason to ever go above 8 reps. Now, I'm going to explain a couple of the things mechanistically as to why that's true. And then I'm going to give you guys an out because if you have a personal preference that you like a specific rep range, hey, do that. I'm not here to tell you like if you as I wrote in my post the other day, I'm not here to tell you that if you do sets of 12 to 15 that you're going to get like, muscle Ebola or stuff like that. So if you like doing higher rep sets, there is definitely a downside to doing that, but you can still grow with higher rep sets. And I think lots of times people take stuff as very black or white, very binary, and there's almost always some gray area and some nuance, but we'll get into that. So I do want to discuss this idea behind the fact that I don't feel like you need to go above 8 reps. Now again, there's personal preference, and then there's a multitude of other things people will use I don't feel like are very good arguments. Let's throw out anything to do with enhanced bodybuilders because that won't come up. Well, Jay did this, and Ronnie did that, and Arnold did this, or whatever. Using genetically elite enhanced bodybuilders doesn't help us understand anything about how physiology actually works. So once you can literally, and I'll do this one at another time, but you can put a guy on gear and he can sit at home and grow muscle. And we actually know that, like proven through like the research that you can put a guy on 600 mega tests a week, he can sit at home and grow muscle. So we don't need to if we're trying to understand physiology and how good training principles work, we don't need to bring in anabolics into the equation or people that use anabolics. Like that doesn't help us at all. We want to actually understand how the physiology works. And no, we don't need studies on guys that are training and taking. The only thing that I can say about that is it would be interesting from the aspect is that my theory is that you don't really get a super enhanced recovery like a lot of people talk about on gear, and that's what people always say about gear. What I think is you get growth stimulus from the gear just by itself. So if you take 750 of something a week, you're going to get a growth stimulus just from taking that, and then you get the training stimulus, and that's what you get. And if you're a hyper responder, then you get like a lot, right? And then you get the training stimulus. But the idea that you recover so much faster from gear is mainly based off some stuff like the Anavar studies and burn victims and stuff like that. And then it gets extrapolated into the training stuff. So we don't have anything showing, we would need a study showing that creatine kinase levels come down when you're on gear. We would have something to show that you get back to baseline strength faster. And we're going to get into that too, and that'll help. But I don't want to keep rambling on about that topic. So 8 reps or less for hypertrophy, I feel like, is about where most people should be doing their programming. I don't think that there's any reason, again, outside of preference. So we're just going to knock out, say, enhanced bodybuilders. We're not going to use anecdotes. We're not going to talk about Jay and Ronnie or Arnold or anybody else who did a bunch of high reps, okay? So I'm not using anecdotes because we're going to discuss the physiology. And then the personal preference, I understand some people may like, and that is why you see the discrepancies in some of the rep range studies. I had one PhD ask me this. He's like, well, if different rep ranges don't cause the different amounts of muscle growth, how come we see, the plot? So when you look on a study and it shows all these dots about where everybody lands, he's like, why do we have outliers? I'm like, well, because some of those guys preferred higher rep ranges, or the lower rep ranges, because we'll have them on both sides. So if you have a preference, if you have a preference, you enjoy doing something, then your motivation will be higher. If your motivation is higher, you tend to go harder at that thing. And if you go harder, you're going to get a higher degree of motor unit recruitment. Now we're back into the physiology. So it's really not that difficult to explain. So if we're talking about, again, our priority is just driving muscle growth and then limiting fatigue as much as possible, then there's not really much of a reason to go over 8 repetitions. So we have to get back to, we have to talk about the 3-pronged approach that used to run crazy all over the place, and that is muscle growth can happen via mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Well, we know muscle damage is out. Like, we do not, the reason why you see anabolic signaling from muscle damage is because the body physiologically uses the same cellular processes for repair and regeneration that's caused by muscle damage as it does for myofibril addition. Meaning, myofibril protein synthesis is the cellular process that we use to create more myofibrils, which make us larger and stronger. It uses that same myofibril protein synthesis, uses that same cellular process if we have muscle damage and the existing myofibers are damaged or just need to be destroyed and then regenerated with a new one. The best way I can explain that to you is like the repair and regeneration. If you have a car and your car gets totaled, then let's say the insurance company gives you an exact same make, model, year, and it just replaces that car. Well, that's kind of like how you should look at muscle damage and repair and regeneration, is that you don't get 2 cars. That would be hypertrophy. You get a car that replaces the damaged one, and that is repair and regeneration. So we can throw muscle damage out. We know muscle is not torn down and built back bigger. That's absolutely false, despite the fact that people still run around saying that there's no such thing as like micro tears that get repaired that cause more muscle growth. There's no such thing as scarring. I've heard all sorts of weird theories. Okay, so none of that's true. And now the other one for a long time was metabolic stress, and we've had a ton of metabolic stress studies that have never showed any amount of hypertrophy associated with metabolic stress. So some of these mechanisms get tricky because we know mechanical tension drives hypertrophy. When the fibers detect tension by the mechanoreceptors, that enough of that sufficient tension is what gets converted into the biological process that kicks off all of the downstreams in myofibril protein synthesis, and there you go. So we know that mechanical tension is basically the driver. That's agreed unanimously by everyone. So if metabolic stress, it used to be believed the reason why this 3-pronged approach came up is because they couldn't explain why different rep ranges ended up creating pretty much the same degree of hypertrophy outcomes. So the idea was if you're using a heavy load with like lower reps, it was just all mechanical tension. And that's why people get mechanical tension wrong. Like heavier loads cause more mechanical tension. No, it doesn't. Like that's not how it works. So they'll say, heavier loads with mechanical tension, but now if we do a set of 15, like how do we explain we're getting like this much mechanical tension and then we're getting like this much metabolic stress? So it's like, you know what I need, guys? I need a whiteboard to like draw stuff out. That would be cool. I think I'm gonna get that when I get settled into the new house. So that used to be their explanation, is that the metabolic stress created an additive effect that explained the just like how we're getting the same amount of muscle growth from a set of 15 as we do 5 reps. So the idea was mechanical tension was only happening in heavier loads, lower reps, and then at some point, as metabolic stress increased, that created an additive effect. We know now that that's not true. We have done a multitude of tests where we have allocated off, you have to be able to isolate some of those things away from one another. In other words, it's very difficult to do at times because it's hard to isolate mechanical tension away from metabolic stress, because there's always some metabolite accumulation. Every contraction that you do creates metabolites. So it's the more that you do, the more metabolites that you end up creating, right? So it's tough to isolate some of those mechanisms off from each other. But we've done everything from inject people with lactate directly into the muscle to the tune of no muscle growth. We've done all sorts of, there's just been a multitude of studies done trying to look at lactate. There was even a lactate meta-analysis a couple of years ago. And at the end, they had to, I think, reluctantly write up the fact that at this current time, we just don't have anything. I know there's been some people that have said, well, explain this one study that causes more swelling. And I'm like, that's easy. That's a type 2 fiber study. And they're like, well, explain this one study that shows, greater measurements for this. And I'm like, that's also a type 2 fiber study, because type 2 fibers produce more metabolites and you always have more swelling and damage with that. So those are not hard to explain away if you actually understand the physiology, like some of these guys clearly do not. So the metabolic stress one was the one for a while. So people would say, like, I'm doing a metabolic meso or a metabolic phase. There's no such thing. Like, if your goal is muscle growth, you don't need to ever periodize or change the rep schemes that you're using. There's nothing, by the time you get to failure, if your proximity to failure, by the time that you get there, the same mechanisms are occurring. You have a high degree of effort, so you're climbing high up on the high threshold motor unit pool, so you're getting as many fibers active as you can activate. And then you end up with a slowing of contraction velocity. So if you look at the force velocity relationship, as we start to get up close to like basically failure, there's a high degree of force. Force and tension are basically the same thing. So you have a high degree of force, which means you have a high degree of mechanical tension that the fibers are experiencing. And you look on the eccentric side, then things are flat. So when you're doing a set of 15 to task failure, and you do a set of 6 reps to task failure, it's the same mechanism at the end of the day. It's just mechanical tension at both of those. The only difference is with the high rep sets, you need all of those reps to create enough of fatigue to cause the other things to happen. Now also, with that comes the fact that every repetition that you do pushes more calcium ions into the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is the cellular sarcoplasm. So it's physiology sometimes uses the same words, two different words to describe the same shit. So the more repetitions that you do, the longer the set goes on, the more calcium ions get pushed in there. So when calcium ions get pushed and you have an overload of calcium ions into the cell, then what happens is that activates proteases that cause the muscle damage. So the more calcium ions that we get pushed into the cytoplasm, the more proteases that get activated, and then you have greater amounts of muscle damage. Again, this stuff is very well documented. We know this very well. You can go out and look at the apoptosis research on calpains, which is the protease that causes basically what they talk about as, it's defined as a type of cellular death. And go look at the repair and regeneration stuff that we get from that. So getting back to that, helping understand, if we want to minimize fatigue, then the more repetitions that we do, the more fatigue we're going to incur, because the more muscle damage we're going to incur. And it's not giving us anything that a set of 5, 6, 7, 8 reps are giving us. So a 5 rep max gives us full motor unit recruitment from the very first rep. the very first rep. That's why I had another PhD try to argue with me about mechanical tension. And he's like, well, if it was just mechanical tension, you just do 1 rep maxes. I'm like, why would you do 1 rep maxes when you get the same amount of motor unit recruitment on a 5 or 6 rep max from the very first rep as you do with a 1 rep max? That's you guys can, again, go out and look that up. You'll understand that. So I was like, well, that would be super inefficient to do a bunch of 1 rep maxes when you could do a set of 5 or 6 and get 5 or 6 stimulating repetitions, and then you perform a whole workout like that. I know that's wild. So the need to go over 8 repetitions comes back to people make some weird, what I consider to be weird arguments. So one is the mind-muscle connection thing. It's like, what if you can't feel a muscle? And I'm like, well, if you can't feel a muscle, there's lots of times that we have poor sensation of innervation, meaning we don't always get that feedback from the muscle, that feeling that we get from others, and that can exist for a variety of reasons. Generally speaking, when you get heavier and you just have to climb up that motor unit recruitment scale, you won't have, because there's so many things that have to kind of contribute at that point, then I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. When I say so many things, I mean you're gonna get a greater degree of motor unit recruitment. So you're trying to access fibers that you don't always get to access. You don't always have that same degree of sensation of innervation, right? That you're innervating those nerves. So when you get to heavier loads, that's what you'll hear a lot of times is you're like, I lose that feeling of mind-muscle connection. Well, let me look at your technique and execution. Are you changing that so you're actually incorporating another muscle? Or is it just that because the load is heavier, you don't have that same degree of sensation that you have with the lower load? That degree of sensation is not what drives muscle growth. At the end of the day, mechanical tension is what drives muscle growth, and we need that combination of motor unit recruitment and slowing of contraction velocity. So the idea that we need mind to muscle connection, sometimes you could go through and not always feel a muscle. You could even do that with one side to the other, right? You may have, let's say you do lat pull downs, laterally, and you're like, man, I can really feel this one lat contracts very strong, and then this other side, you're like, I don't feel it quite as much. I even had that too. But I don't fret it because at the end of the day, I can look at my execution and go, okay, well, I'm doing shoulder extension. I'm driving this arm down. There's nothing that can be doing that, right? As far as like loading as the prime mover, the lat's going to be doing that. What else is going to be doing that? Doesn't really matter if I feel it as much as the fact that I know that muscle is the one that is doing the work. So I don't know why my nose is running, but it is. So the idea about high mind-muscle connection, I have to feel it, whatever. At some point, you're going to have to load emotion. And if every time that you go to load emotion, you lose some of that mind-muscle connection, then you're never going to be able to effectively, progressively overload it. And you're going to be limited in the amount of growth that you're going to get. Now, that's just how it's going to work. Physiologically, if everything's about squeezy, stretchy, all this kind of shit that goes around, bodybuilders talk about all the time, then, and you can never really overload the motion because every time you try to overload the motion, you stop the feeling. That's going to absolutely limit your progress. So I don't think that mind muscle connection is a bad thing. You can use it in conjunction when you first start doing a motion to see how that motion feels for you, because I think it's okay for you to say, hey, I really feel this muscle working when I do this. That's not a bad thing, but it's not the absolute best proxy to use when determining, hey, this is a good motion or good movement. You can get that feedback that says, hey, I really like this one. I get a good pump. Pump's a different story. I get a good pump and I feel the muscle working. And so I know I can overload this movement, and I have that feedback that I need to ease my concerns that this is a good movement for me. That's perfectly okay. But if you're attaching yourself to, hey, I need to feel the movement at all times and I need to get a pump at all times, all that kind of stuff, these are not good proxies or good feedbacks in my opinion. They can be good proxies for other reasons. But if we're talking about, is that muscle doing the work? Well, I don't always need a mind-muscle connection to know that. I just need to look at the motion. Like if you're doing a lateral raise and I'm doing a lateral raise like this right here, and somebody's like, well, I don't feel my lateral delt working. I'm like, what do you think is doing abduction? I mean, it's really that simple. So if your execution sucks and you can't feel something, that's one reason. That does happen too. But if it's a case where your execution is good and you just can't feel it, again, it comes back to everybody has different degrees of sensation that they get out of a muscle. That doesn't mean that muscle's not doing the work. Okay, So the mind muscle connection thing, I don't think doing high reps again, outside of when you're doing a movement that you say you haven't done and you want to make sure that your execution is good, cool, use it then. But at some point you got to load the motion. The other one is the injury stuff. So if you have, and in my Instagram caption I wrote, like, there's always some guy that shows up and he's like, yeah, but I got shot by a bunch of Civil War cannons a couple of years ago and I have all these injuries. I'm like, I am mainly talking about people who are relatively healthy. Okay, so if you have tendinopathy, if you have injuries, if you have all of these kind of problems or whatever, then you just have to learn how to work around those. I'm not talking about, hey, when I do this exercise, this always hurts. I'm like, well, either don't do that exercise, or if you know you can do it with lighter loads and you enjoy doing it, sure, do that. I am literally just talking about the physiology of why you're choosing rep ranges. And people will always get that confused just to make arguments. So the other one is the injury thing. Again, if you're injured or you have pre-existing injuries that consistently bother you, find exercises to do, because at some point if you're going to grow, you want to load something. So I understand, like, yes, as we talked about, there's a wide array of rep ranges you can still grow in, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have you need some type of ability to load that motion. So if you can never load that motion, and I'm going to get to how 8 reps kind of ties into all this. If you can't ever load that motion, again, you're going to be limited in your growth. Now, I will say this about that stuff. If you're using a 1 to 2 RIR approach, a 10 rep max puts you at that 8 or 9 rep range. If you can't load a motion with a 10 rep max without giving you pain, I would suggest just not doing that motion personally. That's just my suggestion. A 10 rep max is not what we would consider, that does not fall into the heavy. That's a very moderate load. So if you can't use a 10 rep max, I'd suggest finding a different movement that doesn't give you problems that you can load. All right. I feel like that addresses that one. Like, I can't cover this stuff. I do this, that hurts. I'm like, either don't do it or do your higher reps that you feel like. The last one, and this one comes up all the time, which is really weird, is like, you can't do heavy loads and lower reps on stuff like laterals or curls or this or whatever. And I'm like, who said? Like, I've done sets of laterals with 60-pound dumbbells for sets of 6 that are strict. And you even go watch, since everybody likes to use bodybuilders and anecdotes, Dorian didn't do high reps for laterals. The lateral thing always comes up: laterals, curls, rear delts. And I always wonder, why can't you guys use heavier loads and lower reps with those? People say, well, you can. I'm like, yes, you can. You absolutely can. There's no exercise out there, unless it gives you problems, that cannot be used for heavy loads and lower reps. And again, when we start talking about a 10 rep max load, that's not even a heavy load. And you can leave 1 or 2 RIR off to spare yourself some of that fatigue and some of that muscle damage. So the idea that there's exercises that can't be loaded heavy is really just not true. I mean, you can load it heavy for that motion. As I said, I think Dorian, if you go watch the Dorian blood and gut stuff, he doesn't go over, I want to say 8 reps for dumbbell lateral raises, or in his cable lateral raises. He keeps those heavy too. And it's very strict form. So there's no reason why you can't do that. Like, are they hard? Of course. But I think people often mistake that, oh, well, I can do X amount of reps and keep my form. You can keep your form and go heavy on laterals, curls, and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's just about keeping your ego in check. So that, I've already been talking 23 minutes. This is already the longest video I've ever done. And I could probably keep going on about this particular topic, because I really do hear the ones that I generally get people come at me with don't make any sense. I don't care that Arnold did it. I don't care about their Olympias. I don't care that Jay did it. I don't care about any of that kind of stuff. I don't care about these anecdotes. I care about what is going to be the physiology and the training outcomes. And the last one I was going to talk about was, some people will say, the meta-analysis on rep range is out there. Guys can go look that one up. There's a multitude of recovery studies that look at volumes and rep ranges, and then they test to see if they're back to baseline after X amount of days. Every single time when the rep ranges increase, it exponentially increases the recovery time compared to lower rep ranges. At some point, I think Chris and I will actually end up covering that one and give you guys all the data for that. I like doing this YouTube to just kind of freeball it and put it out there for you guys. But the amount of research that's done that's looked at recovery times, There's a lot of it. And every time people get into higher rep ranges for their sets, their recovery time goes up exponentially. Same for longer length muscle movements. If you're going to do a bunch of longer length stuff, then it's going to take a lot longer to recover. So there is my YouTube for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it and have a blessed day, and I'll see you all next time.